What's up, everybody? Sorry, a little late. My streaming thing wasn't working. Planetization rising. Hello, Matt Sullivan. I hope you're still there after the troll that I had to get rid of. Yeah. So today, as you can see here, I've got a live feed. This is coming from something called Livestream events, and these are cameras that are around the Kiev area in Ukraine. And before I started today, I had a whole thing that I was going to go into, and I may do it later, about what's going on in Ukraine, but everything is so absolutely crazy right now. It's hard to figure out what's real, what's fake, what the real news is, what the fake news is. And I've been kind of scrolling through Twitter all morning, and there's just all kinds of crazy things that are happening. People accusing others of misinformation. Those are providing misinformation themselves. And I think overall there's just a lot of kind of misunderstanding of what's going on in Ukraine. And I myself, over the past 72 plus hours, have been trying to educate myself as much as possible on really the history of all this, because it's really easy for everybody to kind of pick a side. And what I'm finding, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm no expert on this. I'm just, any information I relate to you is what I've read, and to what my understanding of what I've researched. But I am by no means an expert on this. But it seems as if people have kind of picked a side and said, hey, these are the ones that are in the right, these are the ones that are in the wrong. Attacks were unjustified, justified, whatever. And just to let you know, as more people start coming in, there are things on Twitter that I'm reading that are saying that there's another attack on Kyiv right now. There was I'd say about 10 minutes before I started the stream, maybe 15 minutes, there were air raid sirens going off again. There's nothing. It's pretty much silent now, and I don't really see anything. Actually, I do kind of see something in the background. I do sort of see some light. If you look in the upper left-hand corner shot, if you're able to see it, there's some lighting up going on up there, possibly. So feel free. Again, I'm just going to go through some of the stuff here and what I'm reading on Twitter and kind of comment on it. And if anybody has any particular comments, feel free to chime in, and I will be sure to read them. But one of the things that I read was an article back in 2014 written by John Mearsheimer, why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. And it's a pretty in-depth, it's several pages, so I won't go through the whole thing. However, it does pretty much go through the reasoning of why Putin did what he did. And to give a overall summary of it, a lot of it had to do with the NATO's expansion over time, which really started taking off during the Clinton administration. And this was seen as a threat by Putin. So I guess something else is going on here. Let me turn this audio off. So essentially what they're saying is that because of this continued NATO expansion and EU expansion right up into Ukraine, it eventually was going to make it to the Russian border, which Putin saw as a threat. And he's been complaining about this for quite some time, many, many years. In fact, Russian leaders prior to him were complaining about raising the alarm that this was looked upon as a threat as NATO continued to expand. And the article says that a lot of people, and I have seen this myself, are saying that the prevailing wisdom in the West, the Ukraine crisis, can be blamed almost entirely on Russian aggression. Russian President Vladimir Putin, the argument goes, annexed Crimea. I'm having trouble talking today. Annexed Crimea out of a long-standing desire to resuscitate the Soviet Empire. And he may eventually go after the rest of Ukraine. Well, obviously he's done that. So there are people that are saying that one of the reasons is he's trying to bring back the old Soviet Union. But in this John Mearsheimer's account, that account is wrong. The United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility for the crisis. The taproot of the trouble is NATO enlargement, the central element of a larger strategy to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and integrate it into the West. At the same time, the EU's expansion out eastward and the West's backing of the pro-democracy movement in Ukraine, beginning with the Orange Revolution in 2004, were critical elements too. The Orange Revolution in 2004, for those who don't know, was by many considered a coup involving the United States. And then it was an overthrow of a government that Putin deemed friendly to Russia. And the new government that was put in place was anti-Russia. And again, there are so many more details to go on this, but I'm not going to do that. So for Putin, the illegal overthrow of Ukraine's democratically elected and pro-Russian president, which he rightly labeled a coup, was the final straw for him. He responded by taking Crimea, which is a peninsula he feared would host a NATO naval base, which again, he's looking at it as encroachment upon him. He's looking at it as a threat to Russia. And working to destabilize Ukraine until it abandoned its efforts to join the West. Putin's pushback should have come as no surprise. After all, the West had been moving into Russia's backyard and threatening its core strategic interests, a point Putin made emphatically and repeatedly. So again, he kept saying, hey, look, you guys keep doing this, this is going to be a problem. And this is many years ago. This wasn't just yesterday or this year. And again, I'm just saying this is what's in this article. It made more sense to me to have pretty much a little bit more of an understanding of what was going on. Elites in the United States and Europe have been blindsided by events only because they subscribed to a flawed view of international politics. They tend to believe that the logic of realism holds little relevance in the 21st century, and that Europe can be kept whole and free on the basis of such liberal principles as the rule of law, economic independence, and democracy. In other words, what they're saying is, well, the EU and the United States, our liberal ideology should also work in Russia, and that's not realistic. But this grand scheme went away in Ukraine. The crisis there shows that realpolitik remains relevant, which means the reality of politics outside the Western world and outside of liberal ideology. and states that to ignore it is to do so at their own peril, which is what's happening now. U.S. and European leaders blundered in attempting to turn Ukraine into a Western stronghold on Russia's border, which again, Russia's been kicking and screaming for the longest time saying, don't do it, because you admit Ukraine into NATO, that's right on their border. Now that the consequences have been laid bare, it would be an even greater mistake to continue this misbegotten policy. So I'll continue on with the story, but I've been looking at Twitter, like I said, pretty much most of the morning, and Cernovich is somebody I follow, Michael Malice. And Cernovich is, saying none of this makes sense. The captured Russian soldiers look like kids. Putin is sending conscripted 18 to 20-year-olds into Ukraine. And again, I don't even know whether this stuff is real. There are other tweets that I'll go through where you're seeing Zelensky is staying behind, but then other people are saying that the photos of Zelensky are old photos, the ones that he's dressed in body armor and whatever. There's just a ton of information like here. Russia hits Ukraine fuel supplies, airfields, and new attacks. And again, if we were to look over at what's going on, it's pretty quiet. And that's not to say that things aren't happening, because those cameras aren't in those particular areas. But again, it's just so hard to decipher what's going on. Jen Psaki's in the news today on her statements on saying that we have to get away from foreign energy, but yet makes no mention of utilizing domestic energy, like reopening the Keystone Pipeline or even nuclear. And Trump was at CPAC and spoke at CPAC, and of course you get all the people saying what they say about him. And then you have certain people just, they make their comments that Putin is completely out of control. And I would, again, this article or this paper that I'm reading to you, essentially says that he's really not out of control. He's acting in his own best interest. Now, you may disagree with that, but continuing on, with this paper, Freight Man, there is more to this Ukraine thing than news media is letting on. I agree. And it's really hard to figure out. And if you just got here, I'm reading this article. Well, it's not an article, but it's a paper back in 2014 by John Mearsheimer. And this goes back to the Cold War and why NATO was even put in place in the first place. But as the Cold War came to a close, Soviet leaders preferred that U.S. forces remain in Europe and NATO stay intact. In other words, it stays as it is. An arrangement they thought would keep a reunified Germany pacified. But they and their Russian successors did not want NATO to grow any larger and assumed that Western diplomats understood their concerns. The Clinton administration evidently thought otherwise. And in the mid-1990s, it began pushing for NATO expansion. And again, This is the reasoning, the NATO expansion, and you hear it throughout the news of, if you're trying to figure out, well, why is Putin doing what he's doing? It has to do with NATO expansion. Part of it, anyway. So the Clinton administration in the 90s decided to expand it. The first round of enlargement took place in 1999 and brought in the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. The second occurred in 2004. It included Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Moscow complained bitterly from the start of this. During NATO's 1995 bombing campaign against the Bosnian Serbs, for example, Russian President Boris Yeltsin said, "This is the first sign of what could happen when NATO comes right up to the Russian Federation's borders. The flame of war could burst out across the whole of Europe." But the Russians were too weak at the time to derail NATO's eastward movement, which at any rate did not look so threatening since none of the new members shared a border with Russia, save for the tiny Baltic countries. Then NATO began looking farther east. At its April 2008 summit in Bucharest, the alliance considered admitting Georgia and Ukraine. The George W. Bush administration supported doing so, but France and Germany opposed it. They feared that it would unduly antagonize Russia. In the end, NATO's members reached a compromise. The alliance did not begin a formal process leading into membership, but it issued a statement endorsing the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine and boldly declaring these countries will become members of NATO. Moscow, however, did not see the outcome as much of a compromise. Alexander Grushko, then Russia's deputy foreign minister, said Georgia's and Ukraine's membership in the alliance is a huge strategic mistake, which would have the most serious consequences for pan-European security. Putin maintained that admitting those two countries to NATO would represent a direct threat to Russia. One Russian newspaper reported that Putin, while speaking with Bush, very transparently hinted that if Ukraine was accepted into NATO, it would cease to exist. Okay, so this is back, over 20 years ago. No, 2008, so what? 13, 14 years ago. So over a decade ago. So again, Russia is saying, don't do this, don't accept them into NATO. No one's paying. No, it seems like no one from the West is paying attention because everybody's going to become like us, the EU and the United States. Everybody's going to, Russia's going to do the same thing with you. They're not going to have any problem with it. Meanwhile, Russia's saying, don't do it. So what did it lead to? 2008. Russia's invasion of Georgia in August of 2008 should have dispelled any remaining doubts about Putin's determination to prevent Georgia and Ukraine from joining NATO. And again, for those of you who are just joining, this is why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. This was written in 2014 by John Mearsheimer. And I'm going to play a video later, too, about Noam Chomsky, who articulated everything that was going on as well prior to what we're experiencing. Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili who was deeply committed to bringing his country into NATO, had decided in the summer of 2008 to reincorporate two separatist regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. No, I'm not saying that right, but close enough. But Putin sought to keep Georgia weak and divided and out of NATO. After fighting broke out between the Georgian government and the South Ossetian separatists, Russian forces took control of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Moscow had made its point, yet despite this clear warning, NATO never publicly abandoned its goal of bringing Georgia and Ukraine into the alliance. And NATO expansion continued marching forward, with Albania and Croatia becoming members in 2009. So even though Russia's saying, can you guys stop this stuff, everybody's just giving them the finger. And we're going to do it anyway. The EU, as well, has been marching eastward. In May 2008, and unveiled its Eastern Partnership Initiative, a program to foster prosperity in such countries as Ukraine and integrate them into the EU economy. Not surprisingly, Russian leaders view the plan as hostile to their country's interests. Now, this past February, which is 2014, I'm assuming, before Yanukovych was forced from office, Russian Foreign Ministry Sergei Lavrov accused the EU of trying to create a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. In the eyes of Russian leaders, EU expansion is a stalking horse for NATO expansion. The West's final tool for peeling Kiev away from Moscow has been its efforts to spread Western values and promote democracy in Ukraine and other post-Soviet states, a plan that often entails funding pro-Western individuals and organizations. Victoria Nuland, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, estimated in December 2013 that the United States had invested more than $5 billion since 1991 to help Ukraine achieve a, quote, the future it deserves, unquote. As part of that effort, the U.S. government has bankrolled the National Endowment for Democracy. The nonprofit foundation has funded more than 60 projects aimed at promoting civil society in Ukraine. Sorry, I didn't notice my camera was off here. And the NED's president, Karl Gershman, has called that country the biggest prize. After Yanukovych won Ukraine's presidential election in February 2010, the NED decided he was undermining its goals, and so it stepped up its effort to support the opposition and strengthen the country's democratic institutions. When Russian leaders look at Western social engineering in Ukraine, they worry that their country might be next. And such fears are hardly groundless. In September 2013, Gershman wrote in the Washington Post, Ukraine's choice to join Europe will accelerate the demise of the ideology of Russian imperialism that Putin represents. He added, Russians too face a choice, and Putin may find himself on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, but within Russia itself. So these are just direct threats to Putin. So the West's triple package of policies, NATO enlargement, EU expansion, and democracy promotion, added fuel to a fire waiting to ignite. The spark came in November 2013, when Yanukovych rejected a major economic deal he had been negotiating with the EU and decided to accept a $15 billion Russian counteroffer instead. That decision gave rise to anti-government demonstrations that escalated over the following 3 months, and that by mid-February had led to the deaths of some 100 protesters. Western emissaries hurriedly flew to Kiev to resolve the crisis. On February 21st, the government and the opposition struck a deal that allowed Yanukovych to stay in power until new elections were held. But it immediately fell apart, and Yanukovych fled Russia the next day. The new government in Kiev was pro-Western, anti-Russian to the core, and it contained 4 high-ranking members who could legitimately be labeled neo-fascists. So there have been sprinkles in the news about, especially with Putin is saying that there are Nazis in the Ukrainian government, they're anti-Russian, and he's claiming that Ukraine isn't as nice as everybody's claiming that it is. And again, I'm no expert. I'm just reading from John Mearsheimer's paper, learning as much as I can about this and trying to weed through all the BS that you see. But it's pretty clear as I start reading more and learning more about it that this is liberal ideology and liberal politics from the United States that caused this problem. Although the full extent of the U.S. involvement has not yet come to light, it is clear that Washington backed the coup. Victoria Nuland, and Republican Senator John McCain participated in anti-government demonstrations. And Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, proclaimed after Yanukovych's toppling that it was a day for the history books. As a leaked telephone recording revealed, and this has been played a lot lately, Victoria Nuland had advocated regime change. Okay, this is a U.S. diplomat, U.S. government official, in a leaked telephone call. She wanted regime change and wanted Ukrainian politician Arseny Yatsenyuk to become prime minister in the new government, which he did. No wonder Russians of all persuasions think the West played a role in Yanukovych's ouster. For Putin, the time to act against Ukraine and the West had arrived. Shortly after February 22nd, he ordered Russian forces to take Crimea from Ukraine, and soon after that he incorporated it into Russia. The task proved relatively easy, thanks to the thousands of Russian troops already stationed at a naval base in the Crimean port of Sevastopol. Crimea also made for an easy target, since ethnic Russians compose roughly 60% of its population. Most of them wanted out of Ukraine. Next, Putin put massive pressure on the new government in Kyiv to discourage it from siding with the West against Moscow, making it clear that he would wreck Ukraine as a functioning state before he would allow it to become a Western stronghold on Russia's doorstep. Again, this didn't happen just this February. This has been going on for years. Toward the end, he has provided advisors, arms, and diplomatic support to the Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, who are pushing the country toward civil war. He has amassed a large army on the Ukrainian border, threatening to invade if the government cracks down on the rebels. And he has sharply raised the price of the natural gas Russia sells to Ukraine and demanded payment for past exports. Putin is playing hardball, or was. It's even harder now. So according to John Mearsheimer, Putin's actions should be easy to comprehend. A huge expanse of flat land that Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, and Nazi Germany all crossed to strike at Russia itself. Ukraine serves as a buffer state of enormous strategic importance to Russia. No Russian leader would tolerate a military alliance that was Moscow's mortal enemy until recently moving into Ukraine. Nor would any Russian leader stand idly by while the West helped install a government there that was determined to integrate Ukraine into the West. Washington may not like Moscow's position, but it should understand the logic behind it. This is Geopolitics 101. Great powers are always sensitive to potential threats near their home territory. This is a great point made by John Mearsheimer here. After all, the United States does not tolerate distant great powers deploying military forces anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, much less on its borders. Imagine the outrage in Washington if China built an impressive military alliance and tried to include Canada and Mexico in it. Think about that for a second. That's a great point. What would the United States do? I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a perfect example of that. Logic aside, Russian leaders have told their Western counterparts on many occasions that they consider NATO expansion into Georgia and Ukraine unacceptable. Along with any effort to turn those countries against Russia, a message that the 2008 Russian-Georgian War also made crystal clear. Officials from the United States and its European allies contend that they tried hard to assuage Russian fears and that Moscow should understand that NATO has no designs on Russia. In addition to continually denying that its expansion was aimed at containing Russia, the alliance has never permanently deployed military forces in its new member states. In 2002, it even created a body called the NATO-Russia Council in an effort to foster cooperation. To further mollify Russia, the United States announced in 2009 that it would deploy its new missile defense system on warships in European waters, at least initially, rather than on Czech or Polish territory. But none of these measures worked. The Russians remained steadfastly opposed to NATO enlargement, especially into Georgia and Ukraine, and it is the Russians, not the West, who ultimately get to decide what counts as a threat to them. To understand why the West, especially the United States, failed to understand that its Ukraine policy was laying the groundwork for a major clash with Russia, one must go back to the mid-1990s when the Clinton administration began advocating NATO expansion. Notice how everybody's pointing the fingers at Trump right now. Pundits advance a variety of arguments for and against enlargements, but there was no consensus on what to do. Most Eastern European emigres in the United States and their relatives, for example, strongly supported expansion because they wanted NATO to protect such countries as Hungary and Poland. A few realists also favored the policy because they thought Russia still needed to be contained. But most realists opposed expansion in belief that a declining great power with an aging population and one-dimensional economy did not, in fact, need to be contained. And they feared that enlargement would only give Moscow an incentive to cause trouble in Eastern Europe. They turned out to be right. The U.S. diplomat George Kennan articulated this perspective in a 1998 interview shortly after the U.S. Senate approved the first round of NATO expansion. Quote, "I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies," unquote, he said. "I think it is a tragic mistake. There is no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anyone else." Most liberals, on the other hand, favored enlargement, including many key members of the Clinton administration. They believed that the end of the Cold War had fundamentally transformed international politics and that a new post-national order had replaced the realist logic that used to govern Europe. The United States was not only the indispensable nation, as Secretary of State Madeleine Albright put it, it was also benign hegemon and thus unlikely to be viewed as a threat in Moscow. The aim, in essence, was to make an entire continent look like Western Europe. And so the United States and its allies sought to promote democracy in the countries of Eastern Europe, increase economic interdependence among them, and embed them in international institutions. Having won the debate in the United States, liberals had little difficulty convincing their European allies to support NATO enlargement. After all, given the EU's past achievements, Europeans were even more wedded than Americans to the idea that geopolitics no longer mattered and that an all-inclusive liberal order could maintain peace in Europe. Good old liberals, thinking that they know everything. And I want to say it so bad, I'm probably already demonetized, but they F up everything they touch. Everything. Incompetence is unbelievable. So thoroughly did liberals come to dominate the discourse about European security during that first decade of this century that even as the alliance adopted an open-door policy of growth, NATO expansion faced little realist opposition. The liberal worldview is now accepted dogma among U.S. officials. In March, for example, this is a 2014 again, because this is when this was written, President Barack Obama delivered a speech about Ukraine in which he talked repeatedly about the ideals that motivate Western policy and how those ideals have often been threatened by an older, more traditional view of power. Secretary of State John Kerry, his response to the Crimea crisis reflected the same perspective. You just don't, in the 21st century, behave in 19th century fashion by invading another country on completely trumped-up pretext. John Kerry. In essence, the two sides have been operating with different playbooks. Putin and his compatriots have been thinking and acting according to realist dictates, whereas their Western counterparts have been adhering to liberal ideas about international politics. The result is that the United States and its allies unknowingly provoked a major crisis over Ukraine. I'm going to say that one more time. The result is that the United States and its allies unknowingly provoked a major crisis over Ukraine. Liberal politicians, not conservative, liberal politicians. In that same 1998 interview, Kennan predicted that NATO expansion would provoke a crisis, after which the proponents of expansion would say, quote, "Say that we always told you that is how the Russians are." As if on cue, most Western officials have portrayed Putin as the real culprit in the Ukrainian predicament. In March, again 2014, according to the New York Times, German Chancellor Angela Merkel implied that Putin was irrational, telling Obama that he was in another world. Although Putin no doubt has autocratic tendencies, no evidence supports the charge that he is mentally unbalanced. On the contrary, he is a first-class strategist who should be feared and respected by anyone challenging him on foreign policy. Other analysts allege, more plausibly, that Putin regrets the demise of the Soviet Union and is determined to reverse it by expanding Russia's borders. According to this interpretation, Putin, having taken Crimea, is now testing the waters to see if the time is right to conquer Ukraine, which we already know what happened, or at least its eastern part, and he will eventually behave aggressively toward other countries in Russia's neighborhood. It's amazing how this Mearsheimer predicted this. For some in this camp, Putin represents a modern-day Adolf Hitler, and striking any kind of deal with him would repeat the mistake of Munich. Thus, NATO must admit Georgia and Ukraine to contain Russia before it dominates its neighbors and threatens Western Europe. Too late. This argument falls apart on close inspection. If Putin were committed to creating a greater Russia, signs of his intentions would almost certainly have risen before February 22nd. But there is virtually no evidence that he was bent on taking Crimea, much less any other territory in Ukraine before that date. Even Western leaders who supported NATO expansion were not doing so out of fear Russia was about to use military force. Putin's actions in Crimea took them by complete surprise and appeared to have been a spontaneous reaction to Yanukovych's ouster. Right after, even Putin said he opposed Crimean secession, before quickly changing his mind. Freight Man, let me read your deal, 'cause I'm busy reading myself here. Kerry, Biden, and Pelosi all have their kids on board of Burisma. Look it up. Dirty as the day is long. Yeah. I mean, our politicians, I mean, I'm not even going to go into all the stuff that's going on with Hunter Biden and all, everything that's going on in Ukraine. So there is a lot of stuff, under the rock that we don't even know about. I mean, we hear about, but then that's swept under the rug, of course. But if it was Trump and Trump's kids, it would be all over the news 24/7. 24/7. That's all we would hear about. Yeah, Mark C. And don't forget the comedian, actor, president, ex-heavyweight, mush for brains boxer, mayor. And that was a government put in place by Washington, D.C. No one talks about that, though. It's all this just ridiculous stuff I'm seeing on Twitter and everything else is just completely nonsensical. All right, I'm going to continue on. Besides, even if he wanted to, Russia lacks the capability to easily conquer and annex eastern Ukraine, much less the entire country. Roughly 15 million people, one-third of Ukraine's population, live between the Dnieper River, which bisects the country, and the Russian border. An overwhelming majority of these people want to remain part of Ukraine and would surely resist a Russian occupation. Furthermore, Russia's mediocre army, which shows few signs of turning into a modern Wehrmacht, I don't know what that is, would have little chance of pacifying all of Ukraine. Moscow is also poorly positioned to pay for a costly occupation. Its weak economy would suffer even more in the face of the resulting sanctions, which we're seeing now is the sanctions. I don't know if anything's changed with the Russian economy since then, but But even if Russia did boast a powerful military machine and an impressive economy, it would still probably prove unable to successfully occupy Ukraine. But this is happening right now in real time. So this is 2014. This was written, so we'll have to actually see what that prediction ends up coming out to be. One need only consider the Soviet and U.S. experiences in Afghanistan, the U.S. experiences in Vietnam and Iraq, and the Russian experience in Chechnya to be reminded that military occupations usually end badly. Putin surely understands that trying to subdue Ukraine would be like swallowing a porcupine. His response to events there has been defensive, not offensive. Now, this continues to go into a way out, which this is sort of irrelevant because it's already happened. Given that most Western leaders continue to deny that Putin's behavior might be motivated by legitimate security concerns, it is unsurprising that they have tried to modify it by doubling down on their existing policies and have punished Russia to deter further aggression. Although Kerry has maintained that all options are on the table, keep this in mind, this is 2014, neither the United States nor its NATO allies are prepared to use force to defend Ukraine, and we see that now. In real time. The West is relying instead on economic sanctions to coerce Russia into ending its support for the insurrection in eastern Ukraine. We see that didn't work. In July, the United States and the EU put in place their third round of limited sanctions, targeting mainly high-level individuals closely tied to the Russian government and some high-profile banks, energy companies, defense firms. They also threatened to unleash another, tougher round of sanctions aimed at whole sectors of the Russian economy. Mark C. And don't forget about the real quid pro quo when they get rid of the Ukrainian prosecutor who is investigating Burisma corruption with the Bidens. Yep. Very good point. And again, if that were Trump doing that, he'd be impeached for the 73,000th time. Corruption is unbelievable. And what's funny is how it just so leans to the left by so much. Douglas Hellowell, so the liberals say you have mental illness if you speak the truth. Well, because the truth is not on their side. So the only thing that they can do is criticize and tell, and they portray or they say that you are what they are. They want to tell you that Trump's the dictator. Meanwhile, it's the liberals that are going around trying to create democracies in Ukraine. Susan Cano, Ukraine is made up of many groups. Putin is not interested in militant Western Ukraine that is under heavy Western NATO influence. Mark C., well, they try to deflect the quid pro quo onto Trump. They're trying to blame Trump for this. I mean, Hillary Clinton was interviewed. I didn't watch the whole interview because I can't stand watching her. It literally makes me sick to my stomach to watch her. But they're all going out there pointing the finger at Trump. Okay, so I left off that they were going to put a bunch of sanctions on Russia. Such measures will have little effect, which they haven't. Harsh sanctions are likely off the table anyway. Western European countries, especially Germany, have resisted imposing them for fear that Russia might retaliate and cause serious economic damage within the EU. But even the United States could convince its allies to enact tough measures. Putin would probably not alter his decision-making. History shows that countries will absorb enormous amounts of punishment in order to protect their core strategic interests. There is no reason to think Russia represents an exception to this rule. And we see that that's true. Western leaders have also clung to the provocative policies that precipitated the crisis in the first place. In April, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden met with Ukrainian legislators and told them this is a second opportunity to make good on the original promise made by the Orange Revolution. John Brennan, the director of the CIA, did not help things that same month when he visited Kyiv on a trip. The White House said it was aimed at improving security cooperation with the Ukrainian government. The EU, meanwhile, has continued to push its Eastern Partnership. In March, Jose Manuel Barroso, President of the European Commission, summarized EU thinking on Ukraine, saying, "We have a debt, a duty of solidarity with that country, and we will work to have them as close as possible to us." And sure enough, on June 27th, the EU and Ukraine signed an economic agreement that Yanukovych had fatefully rejected 7 months earlier. Also in June, at a meeting of NATO foreign member ministers, it was agreed that the alliance would remain open to new members, although the foreign ministers refrained from mentioning Ukraine by name. No third country has a veto over NATO enlargement, announced Anders Fogh Rasmussen, NATO Security General. The foreign ministers also agreed to support various measures to improve Ukraine's military capabilities in such areas as command and control, logistics, and cyber defense. Russian leaders have naturally recoiled at these actions. The West's response to the crisis will only make a bad situation worse. There is a solution to the crisis in Ukraine, however, although it would require the West to think about the country in a fundamentally new way. This is all too late, by the way, because it was written 2014. This has already happened, because, of course, politicians that we have are geniuses. The United States and its allies should abandon their plan to westernize Ukraine and instead aim to make it a neutral buffer between NATO and Russia. Too late, akin to Austria's position during the Cold War. Western leaders should acknowledge that Ukraine matters so much to Putin that they cannot support an anti-Russian regime there. This would not mean that a future Ukrainian government would have to be a pro-Russian or anti-NATO. On the contrary, the goal should be a sovereign Ukraine that falls under neither the Russian nor the Western camp. To achieve this end, the United States and its allies should publicly rule out NATO's expansion into both Georgia and Ukraine. The West should also help fashion an economic rescue plan for Ukraine funded jointly by the EU, the International Monetary Fund, Russia, and the United States, a proposal that Moscow should welcome given its interest in having prosperous and stable Ukraine on its western flank. Again, all this too late. And here's a guy who probably could have been actually helping maybe calm this whole thing before it happened. The West should considerably limit its social engineering efforts inside Ukraine. It is time to put an end to Western support for another Orange Revolution. Nonetheless, U.S. and European leaders should encourage Ukraine to respect minority rights, especially the language rights of its Russian speakers. Well, Freight Man, tell me in the chat what I need to learn, because like I said before, I'm not an expert in Ukraine. I'm reading what this person has written about it. He's got a lot of good points. So educate us, Freight Man. Type away. Tell us what we all have to learn, that you know so much about Ukraine that all of us don't know. Go for it. I mean, that's why we're here discussing this. So Freight Man has a ton of information to provide to us, so we'll wait. I'll continue to read, but you go ahead and type and fill us all in on Ukraine that we all have to learn. Nevertheless, U.S. and European leaders should encourage Ukraine to respect minority rights, especially language of its Russian speakers. Some may argue that changing policy toward Ukraine at this late date would seriously damage U.S. credibility around the world. There would undoubtedly be certain costs, but the cost of continuing misguided strategy would be much greater. Furthermore, the countries are likely to respect a state that learns from its mistakes and ultimately devises a policy that deals effectively with the problem at hand. That option is clearly open to the United States. One also hears the claim that Ukraine has the right to determine whom it wants to ally with, and Russians have no right to prevent Kyiv from joining the West. This is a dangerous way for Ukraine to think about its foreign policy choices. The sad truth is that might often makes right when great power politics are at play. Abstract rights such as self-determination are largely meaningless when powerful states get into brawls with weaker ones. Did Cuba have the right to form a military alliance with the Soviet Union during the Cold War? The United States certainly did not think so. And the Russians think the same way about Ukraine joining the West. Freight man, we're still waiting. Tell us what we need to learn about Ukraine. I'm not taking it personally. I just the deal is if you have stuff that you have to let us all know about it, that's why we're doing this. So what you have to educate us about Ukraine, let's hear it. I've already told you there's nothing. Okay, so that's great. That there's a lot more than the MSM wants us to see. No shit, we all know that. But what is it that you have to know, that you can provide to us, that we don't know, that the MSM, the mainstream media, isn't telling us? And what I'm not seeing in this article and other things that I research, tell us what it is that you know that can help all of us be better educated. Even if one rejects this analysis, however, and believes that Ukraine has the right to petition to join the EU and NATO, the fact remains that the United States and its European allies have the right to reject these requests. There is no reason that the West has to accommodate Ukraine if it is bent on pursuing a wrong-headed foreign policy, especially if it's a defense and is not a vital interest for them. Indulging the dreams of some Ukrainians is not worth the animosity and strife it will cause, especially for the Ukrainian people. Just you don't have to type all of it out. Just go ahead and give us a list of an outline, a real brief outline, Freight Man, of what it is. You've got plenty of time. I'm not going anywhere. So go ahead and list out. Just bullet point it. Make it nice and simple for you. Of course, some analysts might concede that NATO handled relations with Ukraine poorly, and yet still maintain that Russia constitutes an enemy that will only grow more formidable over time, and that the West therefore has no choice but to continue its present policy. But this viewpoint is badly mistaken. Russia is a declining power. So this guy says, don't know if that's true or not. And it will only get weaker with time. Even if Russia was or were a rising power, moreover, it would still make no sense to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. The reason is simple. The United States and its European allies do not consider Ukraine to be a core strategic interest, as their unwillingness to use military force to come to its aid has proved. And it hasn't. It would therefore be the height of folly to create a new NATO member that the other members have no intention of defending. NATO has expanded in the past because liberals assumed the alliance would never have to honor its new security guarantees. But Russia's recent power play shows that granting Ukraine NATO membership could put Russia and the West on a collision course. Sticking with the current policy would also complicate Western relations with Moscow and other issues. The United States needs Russia's assistance to withdraw U.S. equipment from Afghanistan through Russian territory, reach a nuclear agreement with Iran, and stabilize the situation in Syria. All of which still In fact, Moscow has helped Washington on all three of these issues in the past. In the summer of 2013, it was Putin who pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire by forging the deal under which Syria agreed to relinquish its chemical weapons, thereby avoiding the U.S. military strike that Obama had threatened. The United States will also someday need Russia's help containing a rising China. And as you can see, China has been an issue as well. And again, there are reports that there's some sword rattling over in China with Taiwan. I don't know if it's true, because like Freightman is saying, the mainstream media, you don't know what to believe. I don't know what is true and what's not true. But this is only going to be, in my opinion, a more difficult position when it comes to China because of what's going on between us and Russia. The United States and its European allies now face a choice on Ukraine. They can continue their current policy, which will exacerbate hostiles with Russia and devastate Ukraine in the process. It's already happened. In which everyone will come out as a loser. Or they can switch gears and work to create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine, one that does not threaten Russia and allows the West to repair its relations with Moscow. With that approach, all sides would win. Well, as we can see, that didn't happen. So that was why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault, the liberal delusions that provoked Putin, by John Mearsheimer. And so while we muddle through what ridiculous news continues to come out, we can see that it was our leftist government during the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations that created what we are dealing with now. Douglas Hallowell had a pen friend some years ago from Ukraine. She would always say how then, over 15 years ago, it was so corrupt and how she longed to get out then. All right, so I've gone over an hour. I didn't expect to go much farther than that, but I do want to play, again, this Noam Chomsky. I'm not a huge fan of him. I think he's kind of gone off the rocker recently, but I found this interview, or not an interview, but he was giving a talk about Ukraine, and he did a really good job of explaining it, so I'm going to go ahead and play this.
Would you just give us some of your thoughts on the current problems between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, let's distinguish Crimea from Ukraine. Right? The Russian takeover of Crimea was obviously in violation of international law, and when the West, condemns the violation of international law, it's correct. But as usual, there are a few other things to think about. So yes, that's in violation of international law. It doesn't compare with what the U.S. does with British support. So for example, take Eastern Cuba, okay? 100 years ago, 110 years ago, the U.S. took over Eastern Cuba. It's what we call Guantanamo. Eastern Cuba by force. Cuba was invaded by the U.S. forces. The guise was liberation. It was actually conquest. Cuba was compelled at gunpoint to hand over eastern Cuba to the United States. When Cuba finally gained independence in 1959, it tried to get it back, but the U.S. refused, holds on to it. It uses it, as you know, as a torture chamber, as a place to confine people that don't know what to do with, and so on. It's also preventing the development of Cuba. It's one of the main reasons for keeping it. It contains Cuba's main port, which points towards Europe for trade. So the main purpose for the last 50 years has been essentially to impede the development of Cuba, part of the whole embargo system. That's much worse than the takeover of Crimea. I mean, Crimea, I don't think it's justifiable, but you can give some reasons for it. In the case of the takeover of eastern Cuba, the sole reason you can give is to undermine Cuban independence and development. Okay, so if you condemn the takeover of Ukraine, that's fine, of Crimea, but then let's add that the takeover of eastern Cuba is much worse. Okay, what about the Russians in Ukraine? That's a complicated story. In fact, there's an article in the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, a lead article, a couple of issues back, by John Mearsheimer, the leading international relations specialist. And notice that this is mainstream establishment I'm talking about, not on the left. The article is called "The West is Responsible for the Ukraine Crisis." And what Mearsheimer points out is that going back to roughly 1990, when the Russian Empire collapsed, there were questions about how should the post-war system develop. Gorbachev made a remarkable concession. He agreed to allow unified Germany, to join a Western military alliance. You think about history, that's pretty astonishing. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia a couple of times in the century. Now he was saying unified, militarized Germany can join a hostile military alliance. There was a quid pro quo, a condition that NATO would not move, the phrase was, 1 inch to the east. That meant East Germany, okay? So NATO would not move to East Germany. That was the quid pro quo. NATO immediately moved to East Germany. Gorbachev was pretty upset, but he was informed by President Bush, Bush #1, and James Baker, Secretary of State, that this was just a verbal agreement. There was nothing on paper. And the implication, they didn't say it, but the implication is if you're dumb enough to accept a verbal gentleman's agreement with the United States, that's your problem. So NATO moved, he didn't say that, I'm adding it. NATO moved to East Germany. Clinton came in, NATO moved further towards the right, to the borders of Russia, all the way along. Actually, a question that we ought to be asking ourselves is why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a US-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global US intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
So there's a pretty good kind of synopsis by, and again, Noam Chomsky is a bit of a, well, he wrote Manufacturing Consent, which I think was a really good book. But I think he's gone off the deep end, and yeah, taking Ukraine by Russia is just like America taking part of Cuba is absolutely insane. I think he's trying to make his comparison, I don't know. But Freight Man, simple, we need to send money over to Ukraine. Everybody in the game gets a cut, then they funnel it back. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's lots and lots of corruption that's going on, and like I said, I'm no expert on Ukraine. I know there's a lot of stuff that none of us know truly what's going on. But like I said, today I just want to kind of have an open deal. I wanted to read this thing because I think there are a lot of people that, I definitely know more about the situation than I did before, but I think there's a lot of people out there that are simply picking sides and don't really know the background. And there's way more that I could have gone into with, neo-Nazis and things like that within Ukraine. So in the hypocrisy of our government, United States, calling people like me, white men are the, white supremacists and all this, every white guy is the enemy of everything. But meanwhile, they're supporting a Ukrainian government with actual Nazis. And just the hypocrisy is it's depressing. All right. That's it for today. I don't see anything going on in these live feeds, and I'm sure things will continue to play out over time. But appreciate everybody that was here. I'll be here next Sunday. I'm not sure yet, but anyway, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to click the like button on the video, and I will see you all next week.